We left off last week with the sonnet in its infancy in England. Through the efforts of Sir Thomas Wyatt in the early 1500s, the sonnet had found a new home in the courts of England. Wyatt was recognized as an innovator in his time, but one contemporary would go on to overshadow him, the Earl of Surrey himself, Sir Henry Howard. Another influential noble in King Henry's court, Surrey, like Wyatt, traveled abroad and picked up the Italian sonnet from the poems of Petrarch. He would compose his own translations of Petrarch into English, helping to grow the reputation of the sonnet in England. Surrey's translations were published alongside Wyatt's in 1557 by a printer named Richard Tottle. Though Wyatt was featured more prominently in Tottle's collection, it soon became apparent that people were far more embracing of Surrey's poetry. As for why Tudor England took such a liking to Surrey, I have some theories. First, by 1557, Wyatt's name was a controversial one. His son, Thomas Wyatt the Younger, was the head of a 1554 conspiracy to overthrow Queen Mary I due to her proposed marriage to Philip of Spain. It is likely that any association with Wyatt the Younger was to be avoided, so Wyatt the Elder's reputation possibly sank during that time. Second, it was probable that Surrey's interpretation of the sonnet was seen as superior. As I mentioned last week, Wyatt's translations of Petrarch were more or less imported directly from Italian. But it's not easy to translate Italian poetry while keeping the rhyme scheme and meter intact. The Italian language is naturally conducive to rhyme, and therefore a poem that has only 5 rhyming words still presents a lot of flexibility. This is not so much the case in English. Surrey recognized that, in order for the sonnet to truly grow in England, something needed to change about its form to accommodate the harsher curves of the English language. Thus, a critical alteration was made, and it would change the form forever. Surrey added 2 more rhyme words to the form, that makes 7 altogether, and he changed the length of each stanza. Whereas the Petrarchan standard is built on an octave and a sestet, or 8 and 6 lines respectively, Surrey's invention comprises 3 quatrains of 4 lines and a final couplet of 2 lines. So the sonnet still has 14 lines, but its shape has changed, and so has its argumentative structure. The effect of the change is such that it transforms the pace at which the poet sets up and resolves his or her conflict. In the Petrarchan sonnet, the problem and resolution are built across 2 slightly unequal halves. There's an octave where the problem is introduced, a volta or sudden shift in perspective, and the sestet where the problem is resolved. But in Surrey's new form, the problem is usually introduced and expanded in the first 3 stanzas, then resolved in a highly concentrated couplet. This means that the volta occurs much later in the poem, or the poet reaches his or her epiphany just before the final couplet. Because these 2 lines bear a disproportionate burden of the responsibility to resolve the tension of the poem, sonnets in this style tend to have a more abrupt rhetorical conclusion. A good example of this is seen in this love poem, written by who else but Surrey. Set me whereas the sun doth parch the green, or where his beams do not dissolve the ice, in temperate heat where he is felt and seen, in presence pressed of people, mad or wise. Set me high or yet in low degree, in longest night or in the shortest day, in clearest sky or where clouds thickest be, in lusty youth or when my hairs are gray. Set me in heaven, in earth or else in hell, in hill or dale or in the foaming flood, thrall or at large, alive whereso I dwell, sick or in health, in evil fame or good. Hers will I be, and only with this thought content myself, although my chance be naught. Notice how the first 3 quatrains are thematically linked to this idea of grooming a description of opposites. The speaker says, "You can place me anywhere in this world, in climates fair and harsh, in the longest night or the shortest day. You can ask me at my oldest or my youngest, but I will always say, hers will I be, and it is with this thought that I content myself, even though I know my chance with her is naught." The volta, or philosophical turn, occurs just after the 12th line, and the speaker adopts a new perspective where he is no longer building a case of hypotheticals, but focuses on the here and now, and on the bitter reality of loving someone and not being loved back. The idea that this is a love poem, in fact, doesn't even hit us until this final couplet, and I think this signifies the effect of the English sonnet pretty well. We have a theme that is developed over the course of 12 lines, in a sudden turnaround in the last 2 lines. Each quatrain has an internal rhyme scheme of its own, A B A B, C D C D, E F E F, making the 3 quatrains function as independent but closely related units. You may remember that last week I mentioned that I'd take you through a brief description of poetic meter in this presentation. The most popular type of meter found in the sonnet is iambic pentameter. You already know that this is a meter with 5 stressed syllables, penta meaning 5, but I haven't fully explained what iambic means. An iamb is what we call a foot of meter, where an unstressed syllable is followed by a stressed one. If you're having trouble imagining what this effect sounds like, then listen to these lines from John Donne. At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls, into your scattered bodies go. Now listen to these from Shakespeare. No longer mourn for me when I am dead, then you shall hear the surly sullen bell give warning to the world that I am fled from this vile world with vilest worms to dwell. Notice how Shakespeare's lines have a more even-sounding quality to them, where each unstressed syllable is followed by a stressed one, and this occurs more or less evenly throughout each line. This is the sound of the iamb. Also, pay attention to the markings above each syllable. These symbols are meant to represent stressed and unstressed syllables. And the process of analyzing lines of poetry this way is called scansion. When we scan Shakespeare, we find him to be the smoother poet, at least in the context of these two examples, because the ordering of accents occurs more evenly. This is in contrast to John Donne, whose scenes of the apocalypse, which is what he is portraying here, are intensified by a relatively uneven meter. Nevertheless, Donne, who was once criticized for his rough cadence by a 17th century critic, is very much intentional in his delivery. He continues to corrupt the meter, culminating in a sudden rush of monosyllabic words later in the octave. All whom the flood did, and fire shall o'erthrow, all whom war, dearth, age, agues, tyrannies, despair, law, chance hath slain, and you, whose eyes shall behold God, and never taste death's woe. The sestet reverses these visions of the end times. Here the speaker pleads for God to teach him how to repent while on this lowly ground, for it would be too late to seek salvation when the apocalypse has come. But let them sleep, Lord, and me mourn a space, for if above all these my sins abound, 'tis late to ask abundance of thy grace when we are there. Here on this lowly ground, teach me how to repent, for that's as good as if thou'dst sealed my pardon with thy blood. I hope you caught the difficulty with which I pronounced the consonantal cluster at the end of the poem. Thou'dst sealed. The apostrophe indicates that the poet intends for you to pronounce both words in a single syllable. This is a common poetic technique that you can actually see in action with the word o'erthrow, which turns overthrow into a two-syllable word. It is, however, unusual to see this technique used the way it's seen at the end of the poem. It's almost as if Donne had intended to trip up the reader. If anyone was wondering about the question I asked last week about how Donne controls rhythm and meter, this would be a good example. Also, notice how Donne's lines do not always end in complete sentences. Sometimes he begins a grammatical unit and finishes it on the next line, as in, here on this lowly ground, teach me how to repent. This action is called enjambment, and it's quite plain to see here in Donne, less so in Shakespeare, and it too helps to control meter by breaking up the pace at which we read. Donne sounds more spontaneous and fragmented, Shakespeare more measured and precise. As far as meter goes, there are as many forms of meter as there are permutations of syllables to justify said meter. Some poems have strict meters, some have loose meters, just like some have rhyme schemes and others do not. The poems we read this semester will showcase a wide variety of meters, so get in the habit of scanning your poems, or at least make note of the tempo, as it might come in handy when we have discussions later. But to get back to the English sonnet, it's perhaps inevitable that I would introduce Shakespeare into the presentation. You see, after the death of Surrey, there came a flood of imitations of the sonnet that were mostly based on his pattern. By far the most well-known of these imitators was William Shakespeare, who wrote over 150 sonnets in Surrey's style. It's because of the sheer volume of Shakespeare's contributions that we sometimes refer to the English sonnet as the Shakespearean sonnet, even though Shakespeare conferred few innovations to the form. Shakespeare never published his own sonnets, and possibly never would have. He composed many of them for a private sponsor, and circulated very few of them among his closest friends and associates. Besides, as a playwright, he made his living on theater, on performance, and on the stock he held in his company, and wasn't altogether interested in having his works published on paper. So when a printer named Thomas Thorpe acquired a manuscript of the sonnets and published it in 1609, the sonnets would be made available for the first time to whomever had the finances to acquire them, introducing people to poems such as this one. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Ultimately, this sonnet serves as an affirmation of the poetic legacy and as a vindication of the everlastingness of good verse. Shakespeare may have died, but his sonnets live on even to this day. And that is going to conclude our second presentation on the sonnet, but that doesn't conclude the actual history of the form. Through the efforts of Wyatt, Surrey, and Shakespeare, the sonnet was introduced to English verse and refined for the Renaissance, but it grew into so much more. Until the 17th century, the sonnet was largely confined to the courts of kings and queens. But in order to survive into the modern era, the sonnet had to adapt, and so it did, from the holy sonnets of John Donne to the highly personal accounts of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and the naturalist poems of Wordsworth and Frost. The sonnet has traveled across centuries and continents, but we can still see something of ourselves in the form. I think there's something to be said for that.